Let me now introduce our first roundtable discussion of the day, titled The Future of Eastern Europe's Security Architecture, Aftermath of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage. First, Balázs Jarábik, founder of Minority Report, Konstantin Bogdanov, head of the Sector for Strategic Analysis and Forecasting at the Center for International Security at Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Zachary Pakin, Deputy Director of the Better Order Project and Research Fellow in the Grand Strategy Program of Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And returning to the stage, Ruslan Bortnik, Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, as well as our moderator, who will guide the discussion, Sándor Seremet, Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Lilian, for the introduction. So hello again. Before I would jump into the panel, I would also like to thank my colleagues who made this huge event happen, and would also like to thank our participants who made a huge effort for joining us in such a short notice. And I think we had a very fruitful discussion today, and I hope we're going to continue with that. As it was mentioned and it was stated, the topic of our panel is about the future of European security. And I would like you to start with a one-round question and describe how do you see the current state of European security. I think we have a very unique opportunity to discuss such a topic, because we have at one table representatives from Ukraine, from the United States, from Russia, Canada, but representing a think tank in America. Yeah, America. Yeah, let's call it America. We have Russia, and we have the European Union, Hungary, in the form of Balázs. So, gentlemen, let us describe what is the situation today. From what is the starting point from which we are trying to determine how the future security architecture is going to work in Europe. Ruslan, may I ask you to start?
Okay, I'll try. Today's one by day. I'm starting the first. I think the main risk today is a misunderstanding of the situation in a general attempt of different elites from Russia, from United States, from Europe to rise the geopolitical stakes. Now elites are trying to blackmail each other by using the political, military, and economical reasons, and it's very common to the situation of the First World War, when the unresponsible elites also were trying to show their bravery, glory, and their ability, military ability, and to decrease the level of the risks from the counterparts, and so it led us to the uncontrolled conflict. So we are in the stage of raising stakes, and it's a very dangerous moment of the human history and human civilization, and for European security system. And moreover, we are losing all these ties, all these restrictions which we had before. I'm talking about the agreements in a military dimension, in an international dimension. We see how United Nations is not only able to control the security and military situation, but also United Nations is not anymore even a table for negotiation, and it's a different situation comparing even the time of the Cold War. And also, I think this selfish attitude from the elites, and Ukraine only is one of the battlefield of the geopolitical fight for the future leadership of human civilization, and but all this selfish attitude of global and European, of course, also elites, could lead us to the uncontrolled conflict with a lot of sufferings of people. We need quite another policy today. We need a new agreements on Europe, which will restrain some military forces, some military abilities, which will rebuild the system of security guarantees for all the players, not only for Ukraine, but also for European Union, for Russia itself. Of course, and we need the new stage of dialogue to rebuild some kind of trust between the sides to start negotiation.
Thank you very much, Ruslan. Zach, what the Americans believe, or what the Institute of Quincy, Responsible Statecraft, believes on this matter?
Well, in general, we've got a limited number of institutional positions at the Institute, but if you'd allow me just to maybe provide my own personal analysis, and thank you, Sándor, and to the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs for having me today. It's a pleasure to be back in Budapest. I think one of the major issues plaguing European security today is that we've established, in effect, a post-Cold War European security order, whether deliberately or by sheer inertia, that excludes one of the leading actors, most powerful actors in Europe, from the continental security order's primary institute, and that's NATO and the European Union. These are two institutions that, whether by design or simply by sheer bureaucratic inertia, Russia is clearly incapable of ever joining. And this is not the recipe for stability. And that's why the war in Ukraine that we've been living through now for nearly 4 years is an example of a nested conflict. It's not just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It is a war over the future of Europe's security order writ large and who gets to make the rules of that order. And I think that that's something that we in the West fundamentally don't get yet. We have really embraced this narrative that the war is about Ukraine and about Ukraine's right to choose its security partners, its right to choose its own destiny, its right to self-determination, etc., without a sufficient focus on the reality that this war is also about Russia, what kind of country it's prepared to be, and whether or not there is a place for Russia at the leading table of Europe's security architecture. And I don't think we're prepared to confront that question right now, and that's part of the reason why we have not yet arrived at a comprehensive settlement. And that is something that I and my fellow colleagues at the Quincy Institute have been arguing consistently for, which is there's no way around reaching a comprehensive settlement to this war. That is the only viable outcome to this war, short of a decades-long Cold War that is extremely unstable and framed by a security dilemma that I think everyone wants to avoid. The problem is no one's really prepared to entertain the necessary compromises and concessions necessary to arrive at such a comprehensive settlement. As I said, Russia has been excluded from the leading table of Europe's security order, and the bulk of the powers in Europe these days are quite happy for that to remain the case, and do not want to entertain an international order in Europe in which Russia is treated as an equal, whether that's for security-related reasons from their perception, whether it's for status-related concerns. There's a whole number of reasons for that, but that basically blocks the possibility of a comprehensive settlement. A ceasefire alone is not going to fly, because Russia launched this war in the first place in order to achieve certain political aims, in order, in effect, to revise the outcome of the past several decades in which a European security order has been erected at its perceived expense. Until we are prepared to engage in that kind of a discussion in the West, I'm afraid that we are going to be in an incredibly insecure situation, and it's not something that anyone should relish. It's not something that the Americans should relish, because it means that the Americans are going to be pulled back into an unstable and conflict-prone situation on the European continent at the expense of developing a grand strategy that is more suited to the realities of a multipolar world, and where the United States needs to husband its resources for a whole variety of different contingencies. It's certainly not in the interests of the European Union, because it's going to require European countries to spend more and more money on defense that they don't necessarily have. That's going to come at the expense of social spending, and therefore theoretically at the expense of centrist liberal democracy in the European Union itself. So very much, the European position right now is quite self-defeating. Obviously, it's not at Ukraine's expense. It's not in Ukraine's interest, because this comes at the expense of Ukraine's security, stability, reconstruction, and its future and possibility of joining the European Union. All of that is only possible if we reach a comprehensive settlement in which the private sector is going to want to invest money in a stable situation, and even Russia. Russia can only seek Russia can only obtain what it seeks from the West through recognition, through diplomacy, through a deal, right? If it wants sanctions to be lifted, if it wants Ukraine's path to NATO to be barred, If it wants all these things in which its security interests are treated seriously, it can only get that through a deal. It can't get that on the ground militarily alone by conquering a few more towns in Ukraine, because that's only going to increase the threat perception that is felt by Europeans and is going to deprive Russia from that seat at the table that it ultimately wants. We need more places like Budapest right now that are actually calling for dialogue and diplomacy.
Thank you, Zach. Let's roll the globe and ask Moscow. How the Russians see the ground point now? From where are we going? Where we are and where are we heading? Well, we can share this
one. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Queen's Institute for Responsible Statecraft for such a comprehensive presentation of more or less, I would not say pro-Russian position, but very Russian-like position. Okay. Look, the problem is with the European security architecture just now that there is no European security architecture. We've inherited a lot of institutes, a lot of venues, a lot of strategic dialogue tracks, and a lot of problems from Cold War, from the late stage of Cold War. In the late stage of Cold War, these types of dialogue, these types of architecture became, I would say, a kind of stabilizer of purely deterrent-based strategy, which rooted in their early stage of Cold War in 1950s and 1960s. Because purely deterrent-based strategy is actually a block standoff strategy. It's not a security architecture. It's actually the tool of brinkmanship policy. And 1950s and 1960s had been, the area for period for an extensive escalation between West and East with a key role of nuclear factor. For example, during Berlin crisis of 1961 or Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and then in late stage of Cold War, we could elaborate a stabilizer. We could elaborate some guardrails for make a possible escalation controllable, to make a situation more predictable, and if European security architecture in 1970s and 1980s still was deterrent-based, it has its own security architecture as well. It has some rules, norms, and joint understanding of interests of all major players involved. After Cold War after the Cold War end, we have received something like twofold situation when, from one perspective, we have a more comprehensive, more peaceful, and more exciting future from the Lisbon to Vladivostok. On the other hand, we have a situation when NATO was still exist, and NATO was not just existed, but proclaimed the strategy of extension to the east. Actually, it was a little bit confusion for Russia, because if we end the Cold War and we're still in a cooperating relationship with the West, so why NATO was still exist? What's the main purpose of NATO? Just to organize some space in Europe or in Eastern Europe as well, and to provide some, universal norms in terms of security governance. But probably it's a European point of view, but it's not a Russian point of view. Russian point of view and Russian threat perception about that, especially after Madrid summit, was and still is that this is a kind of adversarial actions from the West. And this escalation spiral started in the middle of 1990s, led us to the current situation. As Zachary just said, that large-scale intensive warfare in the middle of Eastern Europe started just because of the shortcomings of the previous security architecture. So we could talk about how the future potential security architecture might be considered, might be built, might be elaborated. But just now we are in the middle of the huge security gap in Europe. It's not about putting the finger of blame, it's just a matter of fact. We do not have security architecture in Europe. And our task just now is to find the roots and origins of this problem. Because the roots is not in 2022, it's not in 2014, it's still there in the end of Cold War. We need to rebuild the whole architecture. We need to rebuild the whole, I would say, image of the European security from Ural Mountains to Atlantic. And after that, we can talk about cooperative common security in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Balázs. How do we see this from Europe?
Thank you so much.
What are the points here?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Chandor. And I'm a former EU official, so I will try to make a formal EU position on all this first. As we're calling it, the full-scale Russian aggression or invasion of Ukraine, essentially for the EU have become a shock, simply because it is the biggest land war since Second World War. We tend to forget that there are other wars around us because of a very Eurocentric views, which have been fully adopted by the European Commission and European bureaucrats or Eurocrats. I think the last class which is still believing in Fukuyama paradigm is in Brussels, really is. And the groupthink in Brussels is also exclusive and writ large. So, and that's kind of what I always thought, that it's a little bit of a problem. Nevertheless, the EU, because of the shock, as well as quite a big effort to answer that and supporting Ukraine to defend itself, as the official position goes, have been also adopted. Ukrainian worldview, the Ukrainian position, and if you see what is happening right now with a frantic effort to find the resources, the financial resources, to continue the war, namely confiscating the Russian assets as the only plan to go forward and providing funding for additional 2-3 years for the Ukrainian defense efforts, then you can see how much this adaptation has become absolute. I also think, since Hungary is openly opposing EU integration, the issue is not EU integration of Ukraine at all. I do think that the EU integration process per se has to survive the war, simply because it was born in the war. It was put on the table after the invasion and the initial Ukrainian successful effort to fend Russian offensive off. This is where von der Leyen traveled to Kiev and offered a membership process as a means. It was first of all a symbolic means, since if you compare how much money the Ukrainian effort needs now from the EU, according to von der Leyen letter, which was published yesterday, it's 71 billion euro a year, right? And so just for you to compare, the biggest EU funds recipient is Poland currently in the current financial cycle, which is 7 years, about 80 billion for that 7 years. So in other words, Ukraine doesn't need to be a member of the EU. It requires way much more resources, and this is a very expensive war. And it's also one of the reasons why, just to compare like how much this effort is, which was not only European obviously, but Western, is that this war costs around 100 billion a year. And so Ukrainian defense budget, if I'm not mistaken, this year is $85 billion, which used to be $6 billion in 2021. So without this support, obviously Russia would get a way off. Would get its way in military means. That being said, I think it's very important to understand when it comes to European security that, you know, it was very funny that when Zach was essentially taking Russian security interest into account, Konstantin reacted that this is almost a pro-Russian position. It's not. It's nothing to do with pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, but this is how we're seeing the entire conflict. You're either with Ukraine or you're with Russia. And so that's the adaptation process which I'm trying to refer to, which is absolute and doesn't allow essentially mid-views. And this has changed, and you know, like now I'm going to kind of into how I see the European security. Essentially, if you see Europe trying to mobilize itself, defense and otherwise, since the Trump administration came in, that can actually tell you a lot how the West was viewing Russia as a threat. Now you can see obviously a lot about the hybrid warfare and how much Russia is a threat for the entire European security. This is also in NATO and other member states in the EU strategic documents, right? I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying that the actual mobilization, defense-wise and otherwise, came when the Trump administration came in. The coalition of the willing, right, which is a British-led, by the way, coalition, right? London is playing a key role, was born when Zelensky had this disastrous Oval Office meeting with Trump in February. So it is also a reaction on Trump. And this can tell you everything, like essentially what the current struggle is, less about Russia and more about the Western architecture and thinking. What are we going to do with this whole situation? And that's kind of a repercussion. Obviously, it tells you a lot about the Western unity, which is no longer. I remember when we went to Minsk to hold a dialogue with the government there, an informal one, you know, like the government keeps speaking about kolektívny Západ, the collective West. And I was like, where?
Washingtonski obkom.
Right. And so I don't see that any longer, you know, like there is no collective West. There is a coalition of the willing, formally, right? And it's an informal structure, but still, you know, where the European Commission leaders are sitting, giving them exactly what kind of mandate to do that, right? And then now the biggest, it's a clear, what we're seeing now, the Commission is pressuring the member states to pay up an amazing sum of 70 billion because this is what is, you know, Ukraine interest is. So Ukraine is now the absolute European security interest from the viewpoint of the EU, but it's very different from the US. The US sees European security not as the most important geopolitical theater. Most of the world is seeing the war as a regional war. It's a huge one, yes, but if you talk to the Indians or the Chinese, it's your war. Why don't you solve it, right? Like, why are you trying to drag everyone against Russia? It is up to you. You are Europe, you have the regional war, and if you go to Africa, they're actually gonna be like, like, now it's our turn to lecture you about how to keep your security. What we have been doing, we're hearing from you a lot. So this is the actual duality, and the Trump administration is trying to break out. They're trying to rehabilitate Russia. And for me, the break point of all this was the Alaska Agreement, where the two sides agreed that they're not going to pursue a ceasefire in Ukraine, but a peace agreement. And a peace agreement would essentially means that Russia is being brought back into the table to discuss European security. Otherwise, I agree that, yes, after the Ukrainian war, let's not discuss how it's going and where are we going with it. We will have to do that. We'll have to sit down, including with Russia, or the other way is, you know, continuous confrontation, which I think, unfortunately, this is in the works. Continued confrontation, which is going to have obvious repercussions for European unity, no longer Western unity, simply because the coalition of the willing will be on one side, and we'll see what kind of EU member states are going to be on the rest. We'll shut up here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now we've received quite a comprehensive picture from four sides how things are going on. But as the title of the panel is Future of the European Security Architecture, in my opinion, is a little bit too futuristic, so we're kind of trying to put on the shoes while we have no pants on. And, you know, to take the pants on, we have to end the war. My question would be to our participants. Of course, we don't have the ultimate solution how to end it, but at least it would be important to understand what kind of results the participants can actually accept. Because, you know, we started off with the full disastrous defeat of Russia. Now we're okay with the draw, but still, if you're talking about the draw, we cannot determine what the acceptable draw would be for not only for the combatants, but also for those who are involved via support and financing of the processes. It is understandable that there is a clear vision and need that the peace must be in a way just. Ukraine must receive something due to the losses and the suffering it went through. Russia, on the other hand, must not get away with it so easily, ending the war despite of the result, right? So there is some kind of understanding, but what would be enough for the participants to say that, okay, so we are with the draw? And I'll start with Ruslan, if I may. There are various interpretations, various positions, even within Ukraine. When the Ukrainian political elites, the society, the military would say, okay, we get enough if we will receive this and that. And I'm not talking about the big one that we can read in the press, but the realistic one that's on the ground. I know it's not an easy question, but you are the smartest guy on Ukraine and in the Institute, so that's just a task for you.
Thank you, Balázs. I'm going to make some small remarks before answering for your question. This war now is not about war on Donetsk or Pokrovsk, of course. It's a war about the zone of influence in the Eastern Europe or even Central Europe and in post-Soviet lands. And in terms of Ukraine, it's not a war about the neutral status or NATO membership of Ukraine. It's a war about the in which zone of influence Ukraine will be included after this war, formally or informally, in Western or in Eastern, or it will be a mixed zone of influence. It's a war about from these geopolitical terms, it's a war about the real control over the economical, political, and social processes in all these lands. And answering your question, I will start from our existential interest. Our existential interest, I'm expressing only my opinion, I'm not officials in Ukraine, of course, but our existential interest is independence, sovereignty, and formal international recognized territorial unity. These three issues cannot be overcome in other ways of defeating Ukraine or something like this. I cannot imagine with a politician in Ukraine which may accept such kind of scenarios which could broke all this or even one of these three main issues. But at the same, another way, from another side of this coin, the strong social demands from 70% of Ukrainians, which demands to end the war. But at the same time, only 16 till 20% of Ukrainians, they are ready to accept the Russian demands on Ukraine. So there is very combined demand in Ukrainian society, which is a flagship point for Ukrainian politicians, ending the war but no capitulation. And I think we need to understand that during the war, all the power in the society belongs to passionate part of society, the part which is fighting, the part which is able to go out on the streets to make the trouble for the government. So because I think the peace is quite able, but the peace needs also a very deep concessions from the Russian sides, and any Russian gains on Ukraine could not be formalized in law terms. So if you are talking about the lands issue, so on. If you are talking about the so-called demilitarization on common humanitarian policy, it could be reached, but if the both sides will make concessions. If the both sides move the troops from the battlefield, if the both sides will decrease the level of weaponizing of the region, if the both sides will change the internal humanitarian policy and so on. Another way we will be in situation of the war for a long time without the final solution, and even the reaching the ceasefire in some years maybe, we will be under the huge risk of repeating this war again and again. So Europe will be under the pressure every time, under the pressure of repeating this war, and so it means that Europe will not be secure, will not be safe enough to develop its economy, and will not be the region of flourishing development comparing the United States or China, its main competitors in the international arena. But it looks like now that both all the major players of this war are just awaiting the ending of the fights in Donbass. Maybe till the spring of the next year, like a Finnish president said, we will not have a real negotiation process. But I want to disappoint these sides in these waitings, because I'm sure even any result of these fights in Donbass will not make a significant influence on the position of the sides. If Russia will be successful in the Donbass fightings, we even capture the Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, even Zaporizhzhia and Gulaypole, it will not change the official position of Ukrainian government. And if Russia will not be successful, Ukraine will be able to defend these territories. It also, I don't think it will change the Russian position. So only compromises, concessions, bilateral compromises, ambivalent compromises could be a very hard path, very painful for both sides path to the peace.
Thank you, Ruslan. You just repeated the phrase from our position paper about not losing the face. Konstantin, are the Russians ready for concessions? I mean, we know that there is the holy trinity of the Kremlin about the denazification, demilitarization. Now either recognizes the territories or neutral status of Ukraine. What are the real concessions that the Russians can do, not even can, want to do? And Ruslan very carefully described the situation within Ukrainian society on the percentage of the population that would like to end the war. I would also ask you to give us a little picture on how the Russians see that. But first, on the political way, what the Russians can compromise of, what concessions they can do, if they want to do at all any.
Well, first of all, before any considering of concessions, I would like to stress the situation in Eastern Europe from two level point of view. Any viable security architecture need to be comprehensive and inclusive. And by comprehensive, I mean you need to include all major players of the region with all those rightful positions and rightful interests in this architecture. And by inclusive, I mean that we do not need universal rules and norms. We do not need universal ways of lives. We do not need to be the same. Security architecture in such a complicated region like Europe need to be inclusive and promote a lot of differences and diversities between our countries, our cultures, our regional communities, and so on. So the second level of the problem is Ukraine, because, as I said before, all this situation is not about Ukraine first. But speaking about Ukraine, I think that inclusiveness and comprehensive solution of the problem will be the part of the Ukrainian future, because Ukraine is completely, it's a multifaceted country with different ethnic minorities, different cultures, different languages of the different part of population. And speaking of concessions from Ukrainian side, I just changed the speaking of concession from Ukrainian side, I would say that the main concession would be the how to accept the such kind of multifaceting of your country, how to provide a sustainable social political regime which could adopt any type of minorities, because if you just stop the situation at this level, Ukraine can be the very dangerous place for any except Ukrainians. First of all, for Russian-speaking minority. We need comprehensive solution on both levels, in Europe and in Ukraine. So speaking about Russian concessions, I would say that Russia could not make any concessions regarding the interests of Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. This is just now an existential problem. We need comprehensive solution of that problem as well. So any possible concessions, any possible packages inside any arrangements need to match first Russian security interests in Europe, and second, interests of Russian minority in Ukraine and rights of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. So I think the situation is quite clear.
No concessions then. From what I understood. Well, well, at least that's an answer. Zach.
Well, just going
Keeping
back,
this in mind,
yeah.
what the collective West, political West, the Washingtonsky Obkom, or in general the United States. Yeah, I'm using on purpose. I'm using these terms because there are like huge misconceptions regarding this. What, in your opinion, can be done with this type of, let's say, concessions?
Yeah, so, I mean, just to go back to what I was saying in my initial set of remarks, is that this war is fundamentally about security rather than about territory, including the security of Russia, the security of Ukraine, and the European security order more generally. So with that in mind, I think the contours of a potential deal that features concessions of one kind or another from all sides is relatively evident and has been for some time, which is that Russia is going to have to get no NATO membership for Ukraine, no NATO combat forces on Ukrainian soil. That seems, relatively, like those are the two major red lines. And of course, limits on the types of weapons that Ukraine would be allowed to receive from the West, certain long-range, strike systems, etc. Now, Ukraine, in return, is going to have to get several things. They're going to have to get a pathway endorsed by Russia, which we've seen already, that President Putin has come out and endorsed Ukraine's pathway into the European Union. Whether or not that is ever going to happen is a matter for Ukraine and the European Union to determine ultimately. This is a long-term aspiration, but it's something that needs to be endorsed by Russia. Something that Russia is also going to have to endorse, and we've seen signals of this at the Anchorage summit, is that Ukraine is going to have the right to a large army. And whether or not that meets Russia's demand for demilitarization that they announced at the start of this war, that's up to the Russians to determine if they can sell that at home. But the only viable security guarantee for the Ukrainians is an army of their own that they can use to defend themselves. It has to be large enough to be able to credibly defend Ukraine. And the Russians are also going to have to accept that Ukraine's military is going to be integrated in some fashion, at least from an industrial perspective, with Europe, and that there will be military cooperation between Ukraine and the West, and intelligence cooperation between Ukraine and the West, again within certain limits. and those limits are going to have to be defined, they're going to have to be negotiated. And I think, in that sense, if you want to go back to the question of the security architecture question, to some extent, security architecture implies, and maybe this is just the hangover of history, but it implies this idea that there's this overarching system that we're all cooperatively moving towards, which is all well and good, and I would love to see that in a perfect world. But the reality of the matter is, even if we do arrive at a comprehensive settlement to the war, there's still going to be some kind of adversarial and largely deterrence-based relationship between Russia and the West. And the question is, how do you manage that? There are going to be these disagreements about what types of weapon systems, what types of military cooperation we're going to be able to see between Ukraine and the West, and they will need to be adjudicated. And they will have to be adjudicated in the context of the institutional tapestry in Europe that we have, rather than the ideal type institutional tapestry that we would like to have. So we will need to envisage, and this is something that the Europeans are going to have to concede on, that we will need to envisage some kind of new mechanism. And we fleshed this out a little bit at our Institute's Better Order project. We're going to need some kind of new crisis consultation mechanism or confrontation management mechanism where the different actors in Europe can find the political space to meet regularly and to game out crises and to address disputes and to address tensions, by the way, between the different principles that exist in the context of the European security order that we continue to cite and that we continue to claim still apply, including the right to choose one's security partners, indivisible security, territorial integrity, sovereignty, self-determination. These norms are all well and good. We should aspire to them, but they are often in tension with one another. And rather than address the disputes in public by talking at one another, it would be useful if we could talk to each other and create the space to do so in private. To basically avoid these tensions blowing up in public and leading to the exacerbation of crises that have led us basically to the moment where we are right now, and we're going to be in this incredibly volatile situation, I think, even after a comprehensive settlement to this conflict. There will be other concessions, I think, that the other parties are going to have to make. Obviously, the Europeans at some point are going to have to entertain, the notion of some kind of, arms-controlled talks that the United States is obviously going to lead vis-a-vis Russia. The idea that, it is completely unacceptable to talk to Russia in any form, that is something that is going to have to end. I think the Russians are going to have to acknowledge that they're not going to get their sovereign assets back. They should not be, appropriated by the Europeans and used to fund a continued war, because once you do that, they're gone. It's better to use them as a bargaining chip at the negotiating table. And obviously the Russians would maybe want to finesse the vocabulary and ensure that these assets are not called reparations, but rather that they are used, for reconstruction in some fashion in Ukraine, and that some of that funding, goes to the Russian-controlled areas of Ukraine as well. And then on the issue that was just brought up by Konstantin about the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, I think this is an area where the West can say, and especially the United States can say, we've heard your concerns. Here's an idea about how we move forward on it. And then it will be up to the Russians to react, to respond, to see about whether this meets their bottom line. But bottom line, here that I'd like to underline is that there's no alternative based on the rough schema and sketch that I provided here of a settlement. There's no alternative to American leadership in bringing the different parties together. There's certainly political will in Washington right now. President Trump has made it very clear that he wants to stop the killing, but the only way to ensure that there is security for both Russia and Ukraine, and any settlement must ensure that there is security for both Russia and Ukraine. It can't be just one or the other, and that's a big fault with the European discourse right now. The only way to square that circle is if the United States gets involved. And I hope that President Trump's team understands the complexity of that challenge. I am hopeful. I don't know if I'm optimistic anymore, but I am hopeful.
Well, that's quite a challenge, I should say. Balázs, where's Europe? Where's Europe in this?
So I agree with Zach on two things. I also think that the number one scenario is a managed confrontation between, we'll see what kind of West and Russia after the war. Number two, there is a military solution to this war. But people are saying there is not, there is. We're going to see this war, unfortunately, ending in its logical military conclusion. The question is what exactly that conclusion will be and where that line of contact will be, because certainly Russia does not have the capacity to occupy Ukraine. I don't think it has a desire to do that. There is military and other constraints. capacity issues. So at some point, that's what I'm talking about, the war is going to come into its military conclusion sooner or later, probably in 2026. We're going to see that. So if you look at the US-EU relations again, because I think this is the key, the Trump and the European elites. Remember back in 2024, one of the effort and the word was how we can Trump-proof NATO, right? That was a very European-led effort to make sure Trump can't do anything, can't change policy, right? Which is kind of telling you what's the overall European democracy issue is that, you know, you have democratic elections, but the new leaders can't change policy. And that's what the European bureaucrats are making sure that you can't. So that's what we see now. This is the struggle. The European elites are completely submissive to the US when it comes to any other issue but Ukraine, right? And in Ukraine, you see we're willing to do whatever it takes still, and as long as it takes, and as much as it takes, to make sure that the policy doesn't change. And there was a lot of pressure on the Trump administration, which is having both leverage issues, vis-a-vis Russia, for example, or also having capacity issues because of the foreign and national security policies in the US are disrupted, to make, deliberately so, to make sure that the Trump administration has its way. It does, except it doesn't have the weight, the institutional and administrative weight behind what they would like to see as a policy and the policy change. So, so this is where we are at the current circumstances, and essentially the US realizing how complex this issue. Also, I think realizing the lack of leverage, including on the European elites when it comes to Ukraine, again. It's just letting the war conclude. And that's unfortunately what we're gonna see. The most terrible thing is that this is, you know, like the obvious loser of this is Ukraine. And if you look at the current, how the current equilibrium in and around Ukraine is, you can see a huge fiscal crisis, an unbelievably big political crisis after the corruption, which is domestic struggle, right? And the EU is, you know, we have to confiscate the Russian assets, no matter of the legal and other consequences, simply because we run out of money. And compared to that, yeah, Russia is struggling as well, but they're capable to sustain the current military operation and level to the same extent. And you can see that the gap between the Ukraine army and the Russian army is growing. And at least based on my military sources, it's not going to change anytime soon, certainly not during this war. So the actual outlook is not good. It doesn't mean, and then we can, you know, debate endlessly whether this is a victory for Russia or it's a victory for Ukraine, simply because, you know, Ukraine is going to be remaining sovereign. And exactly as I said, I think the entire debate about, you know, between Russia and the West is going to be the security guarantees for Ukraine is the only security guarantees which is on the table. NATO is off the table. Actually never been on the table, but okay. But NATO assistance, the Ukraine army is now as much integrated into NATO structures as any other European army. Okay, starting from ISR, using now essentially Western NATO type of artillery. And Konstantin, if you're looking for a major beneficiary from NATO enlargement, that was the American military industry, obviously. I find back from '97, and New York Times wrote an article about this, like, you know, like how the military lobbyist is now one NATO enlargement simply because it's going to be very good for the that time consolidating until Bill Clinton U.S. military industries. And you know, you still have the same factor obviously on the table, which we don't really talk about a lot. So anyway, so that's how I see. And then around, you know, Ukraine is obviously going to stay. Ukraine is going to remain integrated informally into NATO. NATO assistance is going to stay. The question is exactly what kind of assistance and how it's going to be limited, if at all. I think the most limits is going to be, and here, you know, like 75%, if I'm not mistaken, all the European money for weapons going still to the United States. And it's also, there's no change, there's no possibility of changing that trend anytime soon, simply because the European industrial capacity is as it is. And that's a question of 8-10 years, if at all, in the current constraints and environment, particularly very high energy prices and others, rare earths and so on, to change that. So.
Thank you, Balázs. So from what I heard in this set of questions and answers, that it seems that we're not going to be friends anytime soon, but at least, at least we should talk to each other and maybe try to avoid being enemies if that's at least possible. And we have 15 minutes left from our panel, and I would like to ask our audience if there are any questions. By questions, I mean not short speeches disguised as questions, but like direct questions to our speakers and panelists. And whenever you get the mic, Lillian, would you help me with that, please? Please introduce yourself, your affiliation, and name the participant to whom you want to talk to. Is that the sanctioned one, or it's working?
Hello.
No, it's working. That's working. You see?
It's personal.
Thank you very much. My name is Georg Melikian. I'm from Armenia. I represent the Armenian Institute for Resilience and Statecraft. I'm the founder of that organization. Thank you to all panelists for this fascinating discussion. And I'm going to ask a very simple question to Konstantin and maybe to talk to you as well. What is the strategic goal of Russia in this war? Not the tactical one, not the demilitarization, denazification. Is it about destroying, or disintegrating NATO? Is it about to disintegrate the European security system? Or is it to be part of that system? And maybe, Zach, you can also tell me what is the deterrence from the Western perspective against Russia? Is it all about sanctions or something more? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. First of all, it's not about strategic goal of ongoing hostilities. The very ongoing crisis is just a consequence of the, as I said before, shortcomings of European security architecture. It's a very rightful child of these shortcomings. We have a problem. We have had problem for decades, even maybe from late 1990s. And the situation is just a logical and very, I would say, negative but realistic outcome of this kind of long-term neglection of European security toward the related to the Russian security interests. So it's not about the goals of Russia to disintegrate NATO, because disintegration of NATO, if you will be the next level of the shortcomings to destroy any security architecture, any blocks. Okay, we could rebuild the deterrence-based security architecture, combine it with confidence and security building measures and extensive security dialogue, as Zach said. So it will be like a decision, but any attempts to destroy NATO will be counterproductive. It doesn't match any Russian security interests.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think the Russians became persuaded in the post-Cold War era that NATO's continued existence, that even the membership of East Germany and Central Europe, not all the way up to Russia's border, but the membership of certain countries that historically have been prone to imperialism or irredentism, keeping them under an American security umbrella was also in Russia's interests. It was really only once NATO expansion continued even further apace that this image was deeply ingrained, that there was this zero-sum relationship between Russia and the West. So I don't think that was necessarily predetermined from the start. And I think today, I think the Russians appreciate America's continued involvement in Europe precisely because it's the Europeans now who are more anti-Russian than the Americans are. And that was not the case before 2022, but it is the case now. So I think the Russians appreciate the extent to which the Americans actually act as a restraining force on the Europeans at this point when it comes to Russia's own security. As it relates to the question of deterrence, sanctions have not succeeded in deterring Russia from pursuing what it sees as its core political and security interests in Ukraine. I think we need to acknowledge that. We've had 19 rounds of EU sanctions now. I don't know whether we need to get to 25 or 30 or 40 before we conclude that this strategy is not going to deprive a great power from pursuing what it sees as its core political and security interests in Ukraine. But NATO's deterrence vis-a-vis Russia has held up, right? Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but Russia has not attacked NATO member states. I think what we've seen so far with the issues related to drone incursions and the like as of late is not a question of NATO's deterrence failing. This is a message from the Russians to the Europeans basically saying, don't try to cross our red lines with your coalition of the willing. Don't try to deploy Western combat forces on Ukrainian soil because we can create headaches for you even in your own airspace, so we're certainly able to create headaches for any troops that you seek to deploy on Ukrainian soil. Those would be incredibly vulnerable troops if the West were to deploy them onto Ukrainian soil, much more vulnerable than troops on NATO soil, let's say, in the Baltics. So if we're worried about the vulnerability of our forces, in areas that are already a part of NATO, we should certainly not put them in a position where they're even more vulnerable. The last thing I would add on this about Russia's aims here, and as I said, it's certainly not to disintegrate NATO. It is to reshape the course that European security has taken over the past several decades, and to secure for itself a place at the table where its interests are taken seriously. But my question is, place yourselves in the shoes of a future historian, let's say 100 years down the road. How will they look at this conflict in 100 years' time? Will they consider this to be a Russian victory or a Russian defeat? Certainly from the vantage point of today, it looks like more of a Russian defeat, that Russia has put itself into a quagmire from which it doesn't really know how to escape itself based on the political goals that it has set for itself. And the only way that it can achieve those political goals is, as I said earlier, through a negotiated settlement with the West. Right? And even if it reaches a negotiated settlement with the West, that settlement is going to include, as I said, Ukraine's integration with the West in very meaningful, significant ways in the economic sphere, in the security sphere, in the military-industrial sphere, in the political sphere. All of that is going to happen. That is an unavoidable outcome of a comprehensive settlement. And if there's no comprehensive settlement, as I said, Russia may make some gains on the battlefield, but ultimately they're not going to get the things that they want from the West from a political standpoint. They're not going to get the sanctions relief that they want. They're not going to get a guarantee that Ukraine is going to be out of NATO. They're not going to get the seat at the table that they want because of the security and threat perceptions that exist in the West. So either way, from the vantage point of a future historian, I don't see this as a strategic defeat, as a strategic victory, for Russia. I see this much more as a strategic defeat for Russia in the long-term perspective of this, which is all the more reason why we in the West should be embracing diplomacy, embracing a comprehensive settlement, because it will not lead to a Russian strategic victory. It will actually consolidate Ukraine's security and Ukraine's membership in the broader Western economic, political, and security community, not as a fully fledged member of NATO. I'm sorry, we're going to have to compromise on this idea that Russia has no say whatsoever over the things that go on its border. But in exchange for some minimal compromises, we can secure Ukraine's sovereignty and prosperity and demographic health. So I would really underline that at this point in time.
Any other questions from the audience? All right, we have three. Perhaps we should collect all the three, as we have only 10 minutes, and then the participants.
Thank you very much. My name is Sultan Zahidov. I'm representing ES and Baku, Azerbaijan. My question is to Mr. Paikin and Mr. Bogdanov with respect to their statement when they said that inclusion of Russia to the European security architecture is key to peace. But okay, on paper that sounds perfect in theory, but how do you see the practical realization of this? Should they, for example, NATO or European Union invite Russia to be members, or should they build up new mechanisms for cooperation in the sphere of security? For example, we all know that there is a largest security-oriented institution, which is called OSCE, which includes Russia, United States, and some other European countries. But so far, one can argue it has not been effective in dealing with the security matters. So therefore, I would like to know how do you see the practical realization of this inclusion of Russia to the European security architecture?
Natalie, please. The lady in the front. And then the gentleman in the back.
Anaïd Pilibosian from APRE Armenia. I'd like to go back to about US-Europe relationship and ask all the panelists their views on strategic autonomy. Is it an intellectual debate or something that Europe should aspire to?
Hi everyone, I'm from Kazakhstan. I'm from Corvinus University. I would be very fast because we don't have much time. So my first question, we did see actually the failure the meeting is actually failed because it didn't actually happen between Putin and Trump, in Budapest. So anyway, but my question is, I want to address specifically to Konstantin and Ruslav. I don't know, what is your, personal perception or your forecast regarding in the next couple of months, what kind of be subject of a next agreement between those actors, specifically Ukraine, Russia, and US. Tomahawk dialogue was one of the subjects to speak, but is any something missing? Was anything, is any subject that has to be discussed and settled down? And second one, I'm just curious, we did talk a lot about security guarantees, but I'm very curious, who or what actually be, guarantee, agreements that would keep in power. So, we don't, expecting deployment of NATO forces between Russia and Ukraine, but I'm just curious, what actually factor or who would actually guarantee those agreements in keeping the power?
Thank you very much. I think we'll start with Ruslan because he's the only one who received one question. The others, colleagues has two.
Ukraine is on the edge all the time, the first. We have very tough calendar, to be honest, because in December we have Christmas, and before the Christmas we understand that political life will be paused in Europe, in the United States. So if something will not be saluted till the middle of December, it will not be saluted this year at all. And it also suits the situation on the battlefield. It looks like both sides are trying to last this situation till the Christmas, European, American Christmas, and then maybe back to the question in the middle of the January of the next year. So there is only a small chance to have a meeting between Putin and Trump this year. I think maybe next year, but I'm sure that Budapest could be the perfect place for such type of dialogue. There is a high probability that this meeting will be in Budapest next year. Talking about Ukrainian guarantees, security guarantees for Ukraine, it should be self-guarantees, of course, so-called porcupine strategy for Ukraine, self-arming. It could be armed neutrality or armed non-alignment. It depends on the situation. But also there could be some kind, even must be some kind of additional formal security guarantees for Ukraine, some like a Budapest memorandum, but higher level document, or a special decision of Security Council of United Nations, or a special decision of a group countries like it was in the draft of Istanbul Agreement in 2022. We need an additional special document which gives us a hope that in a future war, will not happen very fast. And in future war, somebody will be on our side in any case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. Konstantin and Zach.
Well, speaking about the process, I think we're in the middle of the balance between, I would say, battlefield policy and negotiation policy. And just now we have a pause in the negotiations because constant changing in American attitude toward the very idea of arrangement start to block actually possible Russian involvement in any step-by-step negotiation approach. Because it was a long-term strategy under Biden and under the first month of the Trump administration that we need to have a ceasefire and just then talks about the future arrangement. But then in Alaska, we have that summit and American officials start to say, okay, probably we need comprehensive arrangement first, and ceasefire is not a solution. But just now, another talks about ceasefire, about how to stop the warfare. and this confusing situation still do not match with Russian interests in this crisis. So we have something about pause in the negotiation process, and I believe that at the next step we will revive that, and maybe Budapest summit will be the case for both sides. Speaking about real practical steps about toward including the Russia in security architecture, you know, it's a actually very simple thing. We had been there during Cold War. We didn't have trust. We built trust. We didn't have any joint understanding on security landscape. We made it. So we just need to sit and talk, not lecture each other, but just talk about joint vision on the future, on the security landscape, and the strategic goals of the whole region. How we need to, how we ever could establish a sustainable security architecture. So it's not about the kind of, you know, practical steps. Someone need to pay the price to be around the table, and to, like, you need some exclusive, fantastic steps to be included into security architecture. Actually, that's an approach which Russia have opposed for decades. We just need talks about European security future.
Konstantin, I hate to interrupt, but we still have Zach, and we are almost actually, we just reached the time, so just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Sure. So just to answer Sultan's question, I mean, by definition, if you were going to exclude one of the most powerful countries on the continent, if not by some metrics, the most powerful country on the continent, from the top table, which is today embodied by NATO and the EU, of the continental security order, you're going to have a situation that is ripe for instability. That's just the definition of it. There is no future in which Russia could ever join NATO or the European Union. That is just not realistic. It would undermine the sort of structure and rationale of both organizations. The OSCE should continue to exist. I think it can be useful in the future for rebuilding Europe's security architecture when the time comes. I think even the Russians acknowledge this. They've not stood in the way of the appointment of the top four there, when push comes to shove. I think they don't want the OSCE to do all that much for now, but they want it to continue to exist. And it's obvious why it doesn't serve as a body right now for functional European security, because you've got 57 members operating on the basis of consensus. The focus has shifted away from basket one towards issues, concerning media freedom, the rights of minorities, election observation. The perception from so many, not just the Russians, is that this is a body that, unlike NATO and the EU, which became, the top-tier serious organizations, this is a body that deals with second-tier countries in Eastern Europe on second-tier issues. Unfortunately, unfortunately for Russia, I should say, the structure, the membership structure of the OSCE has also evolved since the Cold War. Back when it was the CSCE, you had three blocks roughly that kept each other roughly in check. You had NATO, you had the Warsaw Pact, and the non-aligned states. Today, the overwhelming majority of members, who are grateful to be independent, obviously, and to be able to choose their own, political systems, nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of countries are, aspiring NATO and EU members or NATO and EU members already. So either NATO and EU members or aligned roughly, with NATO and EU, policies. And so, Russia finds itself constantly outvoted. And everyone comes in, they sort of, repeat their official position, in public. This is not the way that you actually manage, security and engage in diplomacy, which needs to be done discreetly, on the basis of compromise, on the basis of dialogue. And that's why we need new complementary mechanisms that, acknowledge the existing institutional tapestry, do not throw it into the dustbin of history. There's no getting around that, but that nonetheless, create the space with fewer actors to come together from time to time and have dialogue. Not to make decisions over anyone's head, but to have dialogue in an appropriate context. Last point, just on European strategic autonomy. I think it is still very much a relevant debate. Obviously, we're entering a multipolar world, as I said before. The Americans can't do everything everywhere all the time. The Europeans are going to have to be a pole of some sort that can manage more of European security on their own. The question is, what do we mean by strategic autonomy? If you mean having the capabilities necessary to manage security in Europe, that's all well and good, but the question is, what are those capabilities in the context of a comprehensive settlement? Right now we're preparing for war, basically, that we need to spend 5, 6, 7% of GDP on defense. Maybe we won't need that if we embrace diplomacy. So if the Europeans understand what strategic autonomy means, it means diplomacy as well, not just military capabilities. And it also means that the Europeans are going to have to acknowledge that being a strategically autonomous and geopolitical actor means engaging in diplomacy, which means engaging in compromise, right? And so there's a tension there between being a geopolitical actor in the strategically autonomous sense and being a normative actor. And unfortunately, the EU has been behaving as if they can have their cake and eat it. After criticizing the Brits during the Brexit debate that they couldn't have their cake and eat it, they're behaving as if they can still be a normative actor and a geopolitical actor at the same time. Well, I'm sorry, that's not how it works. You're not going to be a geopolitical actor at the table if you're just lecturing others. That's not how it works, especially if you don't have the capabilities.
Balázs.
Well, at
2
least
minutes.
after Brexit, the UK returned and now is the key actor behind the coalition of the willing and European security debate, actually. Now, so the strategic autonomy, obviously is wonderful. France has proven in the past decades that it's capable to do it. The question is now, the Europeans gave up their strategic autonomy to Ukraine. We completely, by adopting the Ukrainian viewpoint and adopting the Ukrainian position, vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis the war. There are various reasons to that. I don't want to get into this, but so far this is the biggest problem that, the European elites, as I mentioned, not only submissive to the US but Ukraine, but there is no critical thinking about the war in Ukraine. Because of this, we gave up any connection. Even we don't have a back channel with Russia. We don't even diplomatic channels with Russia. They're pro forma embassies. They don't even talk to each other in Moscow. And, the European effort to make sure that there is as less Russian diplomats in Europe because of the threats and all this is possible. So we are in this spiral. Some calls it the Ukrainization of Europe. And so what kind of strategic autonomy are we actually talking about? Also, if you can take a look, what exactly the EU leadership wants is to prolong the current status quo as long as possible, because the modus operandi is still weakening Russia. It wasn't the European strategy. It goes against European interests. We're sanctioning an energy importer region or bloc is sanctioning the biggest energy provider. What strategic sense it makes? Zero. But we're doing it because that's the EU Council resolution 2022 said this. Okay, great. What is the strategic sense in this? We don't even have a debate about that. So on, not even mentioning relationship with India, relationship with China. Everything is put under Ukraine. And until you see this, I can't, not just we don't have strategic autonomy, we don't even have strategic thinking.
Thank you very much. On this happy note, I have to conclude with a quote of a great man from not so long ago. We haven't reached the deal, but we had a beautiful conversation. And I would like to thank our participants, Ruslan Bortnik, Konstantin Bogdanov, Zachary Paikin, and the one and only Balázs Jarábik. And with this, I would pass on to Lillian and would like to ask the participants to remain on stage.
What a great first panel of our event. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a 10-15-minute coffee break right outside the conference room, so please be back here at 11 for our second panel, titled Navigating Geopolitical Tides in Europe's Eastern Neighborhood. Enjoy.